At 51 years old, Michael Turner walked away from a funeral with less than $5,000 to his name. He had lost his job, his savings were running out, and after years of trying to rebuild his life following a difficult divorce, he wasn't sure what came next. Then a lawyer handed him the details of an inheritance. At first, Michael hoped for a small amount of money, maybe a piece of land, maybe something he could sell to get back on his feet. Instead, he inherited an abandoned warehouse near a forgotten shipping district on the edge of town. The building was worth only $4,500. Its roof leaked, its windows were boarded up, and according to almost everyone who knew the property, it had been empty for decades. People told him to sell it immediately. Some even offered to buy it before he had a chance to look inside. That should have been his first warning, because a few weeks later, while clearing out a hidden office sealed behind an old storage wall, Michael discovered boxes of documents nobody had seen in more than 40 years. Stock certificates, property records, legal contracts, shipping manifests. At first, they looked like worthless paperwork, until he realized they were connected to a company that had mysteriously disappeared decades earlier. And according to the records, some of those documents were worth millions of dollars. But the money wasn't the biggest secret hidden inside that warehouse. The real secret was why someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure those documents were never found, and why one man spent the final years of his life protecting them. Before we open the doors of that forgotten warehouse for the very first time, tell me down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel around the world. And if you love abandoned buildings, hidden rooms, forgotten histories, and ordinary people uncovering extraordinary secrets, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now let's go back to the day Michael Turner inherited a warehouse everyone thought was worthless. Michael Turner stood beside the last row of folding chairs as mourners slowly filed out of the church. Outside, gray clouds covered the harbor skyline, and a cold wind rattled the stained glass windows. Funerals always seem to end the same way. A room full of people sharing memories, followed by a parking lot where everyone quietly returned to their own lives. Michael watched relatives he barely recognized exchange hugs before disappearing into waiting cars. Within minutes, most were gone. At 51 years old, he had attended enough funerals to understand how quickly people moved on. Still, something about this one felt different. Perhaps because the man being buried was the last member of his family he still spoke to regularly. Uncle Howard Turner had never married, never had children. He lived alone for decades in a small house near the old shipping district. Most people considered him eccentric. Michael simply considered him stubborn. The two weren't especially close, but they shared occasional dinners, long conversations about history, and an appreciation for old buildings nobody else seemed to care about. Now Howard was gone, and Michael found himself standing alone in the church parking lot, wondering what came next. Unfortunately, that question had been haunting him for months. 6 months earlier, the manufacturing company where he worked eliminated his position during a restructuring. At first, he assumed finding another job would be easy. It wasn't. Interviews came and went. Promises evaporated. Savings slowly disappeared. Each month became a little more stressful than the last. That morning, before the funeral, Michael checked his bank account. $4,812 remained. Not enough to feel secure, too much to qualify as completely desperate. Yet, his phone buzzed as he reached his truck. A message from an attorney reminded him about the estate meeting scheduled later that afternoon. Michael almost laughed. Estate. The word sounded far more impressive than reality probably justified. Howard never appeared wealthy. His old pickup truck was nearly 20 years old. His house constantly needed repairs. Most likely, the estate consisted of personal belongings and unpaid utility bills. 3 hours later, Michael sat inside a small law office overlooking the harbor. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Across the desk sat attorney Richard Bennett, a man whose gray suit somehow looked older than the building itself. Several folders rested neatly arranged before him. After handling routine paperwork, Bennett finally opened the final folder. "Mr. Turner," he said, adjusting his glasses, "your uncle left specific instructions regarding his remaining property." Michael nodded politely. "Okay." Bennett slid a document across the desk. "You have inherited ownership of Warehouse 14. Michael stared at him. "Warehouse?" "Correct." The attorney pointed toward an attached map, located in the old harbor district. Michael frowned. "That's it?" Bennett smiled slightly. "Along with its contents." "Which are?" The attorney glanced down at his notes. "Unknown." That answer immediately captured Michael's attention. Unknown. Not furniture, not equipment. Unknown. Bennett continued. The warehouse had been abandoned for nearly 40 years. Property taxes remained current. Maintenance was minimal. Estimated value stood at approximately $4,500. Michael leaned back in his chair. A warehouse worth less than his aging pickup truck. Somehow that felt exactly like something Uncle Howard would leave behind. "Did he ever tell you why he wanted me to have it?" Bennett hesitated, then opened another folder. "Actually, yes." He removed a handwritten note. The paper looked worn from age. Across the top, Howard's familiar handwriting appeared immediately. "If Michael gets this place, tell him not to sell it until he looks upstairs." Michael blinked. "Upstairs?" Bennett shrugged. "That's all the note says." The drive to the harbor district took less than 20 minutes. The farther he traveled from downtown, the older the buildings became. Modern storefronts gave way to brick warehouses, rusted loading docks, and empty industrial lots. Most of the area looked frozen in another era. Eventually, he reached the address. Warehouse 14 stood at the end of a neglected street overlooking the water. The building was enormous, much larger than he expected. Red brick walls stretched nearly an entire block. Many windows were boarded. Rust stained the loading doors. A faded company logo remained barely visible above the entrance. Harbor Transit Company. Michael parked across the street and stared at the structure. $4,500 suddenly seemed like an optimistic valuation. The building looked exhausted, forgotten, abandoned. Yet something about it immediately caught his attention. The warehouse possessed character, history, presence. It wasn't beautiful. It was interesting. As he crossed the street, another voice called out behind him, "You Howard's nephew?" Michael turned. An elderly man stood beside a nearby bait shop. He looked to be in his late 70s, weathered face, harbor jacket, sharp eyes. "Depends who's asking," Michael replied. The old man laughed. "Frank Wilson." He pointed toward the warehouse. "Worked across the docks for 30 years. Michael introduced himself. Frank nodded knowingly. Howard spent more time in that building than anyone realized. Michael glanced toward the warehouse. "Doing what?" The old man smiled. "That's a question a lot of people asked." Before Michael could respond, Frank's expression shifted slightly. "Funny thing is, after Howard died, 3 different people asked me whether somebody inherited that place." Michael frowned. "Why?" Frank shrugged. "No idea." The answer sounded casual, yet something about it felt wrong. 3 people asking about an abandoned warehouse within days of Howard's death seemed unusual. Frank pointed toward the building. "If I were you, I'd take a good look around before making any decisions." Michael followed his gaze. The warehouse loomed over the harbor like a forgotten giant. Rain clouds rolled across the water behind it. For a moment, he remembered the note from the attorney. Don't sell it until he looks upstairs. Suddenly, the inheritance felt less like a burden and more like the beginning of a mystery, because standing there on the cracked sidewalk, staring at the massive, abandoned warehouse his uncle had protected for decades, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Howard wanted him to find something hidden inside. The next morning, Michael returned to Warehouse 14 carrying a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and a growing sense of curiosity. He had spent most of the previous night thinking about his uncle's note. Don't sell it until he looks upstairs. The words sounded simple enough, yet the more he thought about them, the stranger they became. If Howard wanted to leave him money, he could have left money. If he wanted him to inherit property, he could have left property. Instead, he left a nearly worthless warehouse and a cryptic instruction. Standing outside the building again, Michael found himself wondering whether Howard knew something nobody else did. The massive loading door groaned loudly as he unlocked it. Dust swirled through the opening as sunlight spilled across the warehouse floor. The interior was larger than he expected. Far larger. Rows of empty storage areas stretched into darkness. Rusted shelving lined several walls. Old shipping crates sat stacked in forgotten corners. The building smelled of dust, wood, and salt air drifting in from the harbor. Michael walked slowly through the space. Every few steps he stopped to examine something left behind. Faded shipping labels, broken pallets, fragments of office furniture. Most appeared worthless, yet unlike many abandoned buildings, the warehouse didn't feel looted. It felt preserved, as though someone had intentionally left things exactly where they were. After nearly an hour exploring the ground floor, he finally noticed a metal staircase near the rear of the building. The stairs led to a second-story office area overlooking the warehouse floor. Upstairs, immediately he thought of Howard's note. He climbed the staircase carefully. The metal steps echoed through the empty building. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched between several office doors. Most stood partially open. Inside, old desks and filing cabinets remained exactly where employees had left them decades earlier. Dust covered everything. Yet once again, the scene felt strangely organized. Michael entered the first office. Empty. The second contained a desk, several chairs, and a calendar still hanging on the wall. The year printed across the top immediately caught his attention. 1983. 40 years earlier. He stood silently for a moment, imagining workers walking these hallways during the warehouse's busiest years. Then something unusual caught his eye. On one wall hung a large framed photograph. The image showed dozens of employees standing outside the warehouse during some kind of company celebration. Men in work uniforms, office staff, managers, everyone smiling proudly. Michael stepped closer. Harbor Transit Company. The name appeared across a banner held by several workers. Then he noticed something odd. Near the edge of the photograph, a section had been deliberately cut away. Not damaged, removed. A person had clearly been cropped out. Michael frowned. Why would someone cut a single individual from an old company photograph? Before he could think much more about it, voices echoed from below. Surprised, he moved toward a window overlooking the warehouse floor. A younger man stood near the entrance carrying a toolbox. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, dark hair, work boots, harbor maintenance jacket. When he noticed Michael, he waved. "Sorry," the man called. "Door was open." A few minutes later, they introduced themselves. The visitor's name was Daniel Ross. He owned a small repair business nearby. "People said someone finally inherited this place," Daniel explained. Michael laughed softly. "News travels fast. In this part of town, it does." Daniel glanced around the warehouse. "What are you planning to do with it?" "Trying to figure that out." Daniel nodded. "Fair answer." Over the next hour, Daniel helped Michael inspect parts of the building. He pointed out structural issues, roof damage, and areas requiring repairs. Most observations weren't encouraging. Yet Daniel seemed genuinely interested in the warehouse. More importantly, he seemed knowledgeable about local history. Eventually, Michael mentioned Harbor Transit Company. Daniel immediately recognized the name. "My grandfather worked here." Michael looked surprised. "Really?" Daniel nodded. "For years." "What happened to the company?" The younger man shrugged. "Depends who you ask." That answer immediately captured Michael's attention. "What does that mean?" Daniel hesitated. "Officially, bankruptcy. Unofficially?" Daniel looked around the warehouse. People always thought there was more to the story. The comment lingered in Michael's mind long after Daniel returned to work. Later that afternoon, he drove into town searching for more information. His first stop was the local library. The building sat inside a restored brick structure overlooking the harbor. Inside, rows of books stretched beneath tall windows. Behind the main desk stood a woman organizing historical records. She introduced herself as Lisa Carter. When Michael mentioned Harbor Transit Company, her expression immediately brightened. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while." Within minutes, she led him toward a local history archive. Old newspapers, business directories, and photographs filled several shelves. Together, they began searching. Harbor Transit Company appeared everywhere during the 1960s and 1970s. Shipping contracts, community events, charity donations, business awards. The company seemed deeply connected to the town. Then, almost abruptly, references stopped. "That's strange," Lisa said. "What is?" Michael asked. She pointed toward a newspaper index. "The company disappears," he frowned. "Companies go out of business. Not usually like this." Lisa showed him several gaps in the historical record. Articles referenced investigations but provided few details. Key individuals seemed absent from later reports. Certain names appeared repeatedly before vanishing altogether. Then Michael saw a familiar name. Samuel Harper, the company's founder. According to early articles, he was one of the most influential businessmen in town. Yet after the collapse, he seemed to disappear completely. No interviews, no public statements, nothing. Michael stared at the records. "That's odd." Lisa nodded. "Very odd." As evening approached, Michael returned to the warehouse carrying photocopies of several articles. The setting sun filtered through broken windows, casting long shadows across the building. Before leaving, he climbed back to the upstairs offices one final time. Something about them continued bothering him, specifically the layout. The offices looked smaller than they should. Standing in the hallway, he studied the floor plan carefully. Then he stopped. One wall extended much farther than necessary. According to the building's exterior dimensions, there should have been additional space behind it. Significant space. Michael measured several sections using a tape measure he found downstairs. The numbers confirmed his suspicion. Nearly 10 feet of space appeared to be missing. He stared at the wall, then at the hallway, then back at the wall. The realization sent a small chill through him. Warehouses don't accidentally lose entire rooms. Suddenly, his uncle's final instruction felt far more important, because for the first time since inheriting the building, Michael had evidence that something inside Warehouse 14 wasn't quite what it appeared to be. Michael spent most of the night thinking about the missing space behind the upstairs offices. The measurements refused to leave his mind. Buildings could have strange layouts. Walls could be added during renovations. Storage areas could be sealed off. Yet 10 feet of missing space felt excessive. More importantly, it felt intentional. By sunrise, he was back at Warehouse 14, carrying a flashlight, a tape measure, and a notebook filled with rough sketches. The harbor district remained quiet at that hour. Fishing boats drifted slowly through the morning fog. Seagulls circled above the waterfront. The warehouse stood exactly as it had the day before, silent and imposing against the gray sky. Once inside, Michael headed straight for the upstairs offices. He measured everything again: hallway length, office dimensions, exterior wall distances. The results matched perfectly. Somewhere behind the far wall existed the section of the building no longer accessible. The realization sent a small thrill through him. For the first time in months, he found himself genuinely excited about something. Around mid-morning, Daniel arrived carrying tools. "Let me guess," he said after climbing the stairs. "You're still thinking about the missing room?" Michael laughed. "It bothers me." Daniel glanced toward the hallway wall. "Good. It should." Together they spent the next several hours examining the office area. Most walls appeared original. Some sections showed signs of repair. Then Daniel noticed something unusual near the floor behind an old filing cabinet. "Come look at this." Michael moved beside him. A narrow metal strip ran vertically along the wall. At first glance, it seemed insignificant. Yet unlike the surrounding materials, it wasn't covered in the same paint. Someone had attempted to conceal it. "That wasn't part of the original construction," Daniel said. Michael ran his fingers across the surface. The metal felt smooth compared to the surrounding wall, almost like part of a door frame. His pulse quickened. "You think it's an entrance?" Daniel shrugged. "I think somebody wanted it hidden." The distinction mattered. Throughout the afternoon, they searched for additional clues. Several old offices contained filing cabinets left behind when the company closed. Most drawers were empty. Others held routine paperwork, shipping schedules, employee notices, maintenance records. Then Michael discovered a locked drawer hidden inside an executive desk. The lock gave way easily after decades of neglect. Inside rested a collection of photographs. Most showed warehouse employees during different periods, dock workers loading cargo, office staff posing during holidays, managers standing beside delivery trucks. Then Michael found another image with a section removed. Just like the photograph hanging on the wall, someone had deliberately cut a person out. He studied the remaining faces carefully. Different event, different year, same missing individual. "That's not a coincidence," Daniel said quietly. Michael agreed. The question was why. He flipped the photograph over. Written on the back were several names identifying people in the image. One line had been crossed out heavily with black ink. Despite the damage, part of the name remained visible. Samuel Harper. The same Samuel Harper who founded Harbor Transit Company. Michael stared at the writing. Why would someone erase the founder from company photographs? The mystery deepened further that afternoon when he visited the library again. Lisa greeted him with a stack of old newspaper clippings already waiting on a table. "I think I found something." Michael sat immediately. Most articles discussed Harbor Transit's rapid growth during the 1960s and 1970s. The company appeared successful, respected, important to the local economy. Then the tone shifted. Financial concerns emerged. Business disputes followed. Several articles referenced investigations, yet the details seemed strangely vague. More than once, entire sections appeared missing from archived copies. Lisa frowned while comparing records. "I've never seen anything like this." "Meaning?" Michael asked. "It's as if somebody removed pieces of the story." The statement lingered in the air. Later, she produced another discovery. An old business directory listed Harbor Transit executives. Samuel Harper's name appeared at the top. Then, several years later, he vanished completely. No explanation, no retirement announcement, no obituary. Nothing. "People don't usually disappear from public records like that," Lisa said. Michael nodded slowly. The more he learned, the more Samuel Harper resembled a ghost, a founder erased from his own company's history. By evening, Michael returned to the warehouse carrying copies of the records. The setting sun cast long shadows through broken windows. Upstairs, the hallway felt quieter than ever. He found himself staring once more at the suspicious wall. Then he noticed something new. A faint difference in color near one section of paneling. Tiny, barely visible. Curious. He tapped the area with his knuckles. Most of the wall produced a solid sound. One section produced a hollow echo. Michael froze. He tapped it again. Hollow. Daniel looked up immediately. "You hear that?" Michael nodded. His heart began beating faster. They spent the next hour examining the section carefully. The outline gradually emerged. Hidden beneath layers of paint and repair work was a rectangular shape. Not a wall. A doorway. A doorway someone had intentionally concealed. As darkness settled outside, Michael shined his flashlight along the lower edge. There, nearly invisible beneath decades of dust, he spotted something metallic. A keyhole. Small. Old. Untouched. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Because suddenly the missing space behind the offices wasn't merely empty square footage. It was a hidden room. A room somebody worked very hard to erase. And judging by the erased photographs, missing records, and repeated references to Samuel Harper, Michael had a feeling that whatever waited behind that door was connected to the mystery the town had forgotten decades ago. Michael barely slept that night. The image of the hidden keyhole behind the upstairs wall kept replaying in his mind. Every clue seemed connected now. The erased photographs, the missing records, Samuel Harper's disappearance from local history, and now a concealed doorway hidden inside Warehouse 14. The deeper he dug, the harder it became to believe any of it was accidental. By sunrise, he was already unlocking the warehouse. The harbor district remained quiet, except for distant gulls and the occasional rumble of fishing boats heading out to sea. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the warehouse roof, illuminating floating dust particles like tiny stars suspended in the air. Michael headed upstairs immediately. The hidden doorway waited exactly where he had left it. The small brass keyhole sat near the floor, almost invisible beneath layers of paint. Seeing it again made the mystery feel real. Not theoretical. Not imagined. Real. Around 9 o'clock, Daniel arrived carrying a toolbox and 2 coffees. "You look terrible," he said. Michael accepted the coffee. "That's because I spent half the night thinking about a keyhole." Daniel laughed. "Fair enough." Together they examined the concealed doorway more carefully. The keyhole appeared old, much older than the surrounding repairs. Whoever sealed the entrance had hidden the lock, but never removed it. That detail felt important, almost deliberate, as if someone expected the door to be opened someday. The problem was obvious. They didn't have a key. For several hours, they searched every office upstairs. Filing cabinets, desk drawers, storage closets, anything capable of hiding an old key. Most searches ended in disappointment. Then shortly after noon, Michael discovered something unusual inside the bottom drawer of a rusted filing cabinet. A small wooden box. Unlike most items in the warehouse, the box looked carefully preserved. Dust covered the exterior, but the hinges remained clean. Curious. He opened it. Inside rested several objects: a fountain pen, a pocket watch that no longer worked, and a brass key attached to a faded leather tag. Michael's pulse quickened immediately. Written on the tag were 3 words: Executive Records Room. Silence filled the office. Daniel looked at the key, then at Michael. "Well," he said quietly, "that seems promising." The key looked old, very old. More importantly, it looked untouched, as if it had spent decades waiting inside that box. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that somebody had placed it there intentionally. The 2 men carried it back to the hidden doorway. Neither spoke much. Anticipation had replaced conversation. The brass key slid smoothly into the lock for several seconds. Michael simply stared at it. Then he turned it. Nothing happened. His stomach dropped. He tried again. This time, a loud metallic click echoed inside the wall. Both men froze. The sound seemed impossibly loud inside the empty warehouse. Michael slowly pushed against the concealed panel. At first, nothing moved. Then a faint groan emerged from somewhere behind the wall. Dust drifted from the frame. The doorway shifted slightly inward. Daniel grinned immediately. "That's definitely a door." Another push widened the opening. Ancient hinges protested loudly. Decades of silence shattered in a cloud of dust and stale air. Finally, the hidden door opened enough to reveal darkness beyond. Michael raised his flashlight. The beam disappeared into a room much larger than either expected. Shelves lined the walls. Filing cabinets stood in neat rows. Tables occupied the center. The space looked less like storage and more like an office frozen in time. Nobody had entered for decades, yet remarkably, everything remained organized, preserved, waiting. Michael stepped inside first. Dust covered every surface, but the room itself felt untouched. A large desk stood near one wall. Maps hung inside glass frames. Filing cabinets stretched almost to the ceiling. Daniel slowly turned in a circle. This wasn't a storage room. Michael nodded. No. The realization settled over both men. Someone had intentionally hidden an entire records office, an office large enough to manage a major company. The question was, why? Hours passed as they explored. Every drawer revealed more documents: shipping records, business contracts, employee files, corporate correspondence. Harbor Transit Company appeared on nearly everything. Yet unlike the incomplete records found elsewhere, these files looked complete, intact, preserved. Then Michael noticed a framed photograph hanging above the main desk. His heart skipped immediately. It showed the same company celebration he had seen earlier, the same image with dozens of employees standing outside the warehouse. But this version was complete. Nobody had been removed. Standing proudly in the center was Samuel Harper himself. For the first time, Michael saw the man everyone seemed determined to erase. He appeared confident, respected, the kind of person who built something from nothing. Michael stepped closer. Beneath the frame hung a brass plaque. Founder and President, Samuel Harper. Daniel stared at the image. Someone really didn't want people remembering him. Michael nodded slowly. The complete photograph raised more questions than answers. Why erase the founder? Why hide the office? Why preserve thousands of records inside a sealed room? As evening approached, Michael sat at the old desk while reviewing another stack of documents. Most appeared routine, until he discovered a newspaper clipping tucked inside a ledger book. The headline immediately caught his attention. Harbor Transit announces sudden closure. The article described financial troubles and bankruptcy proceedings. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then Michael noticed several handwritten notes in the margin. Someone had circled specific paragraphs repeatedly. Beside one section, a message appeared in blue ink. The public story is not the truth. A chill ran through him. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Uncle Howard's. Michael stared at the words for several long seconds. The room suddenly felt different, more personal. Howard hadn't simply owned the warehouse. He had been investigating something, protecting something. The hidden office wasn't forgotten. It had been maintained, watched over, preserved. Then Michael opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside sat a thick leather ledger unlike anything else in the room. Across the front cover, embossed in fading gold letters, were 4 words that instantly accelerated his heartbeat. Confidential Ownership Records. Suddenly, standing inside the hidden office, Michael realized he was no longer searching for an abandoned company's history. He was standing on the edge of whatever secret had convinced someone to hide an entire room full of documents for more than 40 years. Michael remained in the hidden office long after the sun disappeared beyond the harbor. The warehouse below had become a cavern of shadows, yet he barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the thick leather ledger resting on Samuel Harper's desk. Confidential Ownership Records. The title alone suggested importance, but after everything he had already discovered, the hidden room, the erased photographs, the preserved archives, he suspected the ledger contained something far more significant than ordinary business paperwork. Daniel sat across from him, flipping through stacks of shipping records. Occasionally, he glanced toward the ledger with obvious curiosity. "You planning to open that?" he finally asked. Michael smiled faintly. "Trying to build suspense." Daniel laughed. "It's working." Slowly, Michael opened the cover. The first pages appeared surprisingly ordinary. Ownership summaries, corporate filings, property inventories. Harbor Transit Company controlled far more assets than he expected. Warehouses, dock facilities, storage yards, equipment leases. Several properties stretched across multiple states. During its peak years, the company had been enormous, much larger than newspaper articles suggested. "This wasn't a small operation," Daniel said quietly. Michael nodded. The deeper they read, the clearer it became. Harbor Transit wasn't merely a local shipping company. It was a regional powerhouse. Then something unusual appeared. Several pages near the middle contained handwritten annotations added years after the original entries. Different ink, different handwriting. Michael immediately recognized it. Uncle Howard. He leaned closer. Certain assets had been circled repeatedly, ownership percentages highlighted, notes filled the margins. Most ended with question marks, as though Howard spent years trying to understand something hidden inside the records. One comment especially stood out. Where did these shares go? Michael stared at the note. Shares. The word appeared again and again throughout the ledger. Share transfers, ownership certificates, equity allocations. Large portions of the company seemed divided among employees and early investors. Yet many entries ended abruptly. Records stopped. Ownership trails vanished. The pattern felt familiar. Another missing piece of history. The following morning, Michael returned with Lisa. The librarian immediately became fascinated by the hidden office. For nearly an hour, she wandered among shelves, examining documents. "This is unbelievable," she whispered repeatedly. Eventually, Michael showed her the ledger. Within minutes, she noticed something important. "These aren't just company records." Michael looked up. "What do you mean?" Lisa pointed toward several entries. These ownership certificates were never closed. Silence settled over the room. Michael frowned. "Explain that." Lisa carefully turned several pages. When a company dissolves properly, ownership interests are terminated, transferred, or settled. She tapped the ledger. A lot of these records show none of that. Michael exchanged a glance with Daniel. Suddenly, the documents felt much more important. Throughout the afternoon, they examined certificate records and shareholder lists. Hundreds of names appeared. Dock workers, supervisors, managers, local investors. Many owned small percentages of Harbor Transit, most likely through employee ownership programs established decades earlier. Then Lisa found something that changed the investigation completely. Tucked inside a filing cabinet stood several boxes labeled Outstanding Certificates. Michael carefully opened the first one. Inside rested dozens of original stock certificates, then dozens more, then hundreds. Every certificate appeared authentic, official, untouched. "These should not be here," Lisa said quietly. Michael looked up. "Why?" "Because if the company dissolved the way public records claim, these would have been surrendered or canceled." Nobody spoke for several moments. The room suddenly felt smaller, more serious. Daniel finally broke the silence. "You're telling me these certificates might still matter?" Lisa hesitated. "I'm saying somebody needs to figure out why they were never processed." The distinction mattered. Yet even that possibility felt enormous. By late afternoon, Michael discovered another clue, hidden inside one of Howard's folders. Unlike the corporate documents surrounding it, this folder contained personal notes. Years of notes. Howard had apparently spent decades investigating Harbor Transit's collapse. Newspaper clippings, property records, legal summaries, timelines, questions. Entire sections connected by handwritten arrows. One page immediately caught Michael's attention. Across the top, Howard had written, "Follow the ownership trail." Beneath the heading appeared dozens of names linked together through transfers, mergers, and property acquisitions. Near the center sat a heavily circled note. Assets never disappeared. Ownership records did. Michael read the sentence twice, then a third time. A chill moved through him. The statement explained everything. Public history claimed Harbor Transit failed and its assets vanished. Howard clearly believed otherwise. He believed the assets remained somewhere, hidden behind missing paperwork and incomplete records. Then Michael noticed another name appearing repeatedly throughout Howard's investigation. Samuel Harper, the founder, the man erased from photographs, the man seemingly erased from history. Yet according to Howard's notes, Samuel spent years fighting legal disputes after the company's collapse. Then he vanished from public view. The pattern felt familiar, almost identical to what Michael had already seen. Important records hidden, important people erased, important questions left unanswered. As evening approached, Frank Wilson unexpectedly arrived at the warehouse. The elderly dock worker climbed the stairs slowly and stared at the hidden office for nearly a full minute. "I never thought I'd see this room again." Michael froze. "You've been here before?" Frank nodded. "Once." Everyone immediately stopped what they were doing. Michael pulled up a chair. "Start talking." Frank smiled faintly. Then his expression became serious. "When I was young, people said Samuel Harper kept the company's most important records in a private office nobody could access." He looked around the room. This office. Michael felt his pulse quicken. Did anyone know what was inside? Frank shook his head. "Only rumors." "What kind of rumors?" The old dock worker stared at the rows of filing cabinets. "That Samuel was hiding proof." Silence filled the room. Michael leaned forward. "Proof of what?" Frank's eyes moved toward the ledger on the desk, then toward the boxes of stock certificates. Finally, he answered, "That the company wasn't actually bankrupt." Nobody spoke. Not Michael, not Daniel, not Lisa. The statement hung in the air like a storm cloud, because suddenly the hidden office wasn't just preserving business records. It might be preserving evidence. Evidence capable of explaining why Harbor Transit disappeared, why Samuel Harper was erased, why Howard spent decades protecting the warehouse, and why somebody went to extraordinary lengths to make sure this room remained hidden for more than 40 years. Michael couldn't stop thinking about Frank Wilson's words, that the company wasn't actually bankrupt. The statement sounded impossible. Harbor Transit had collapsed more than 40 years ago. Newspaper articles documented it. Court records referenced it. Entire sections of the Harbor District had declined afterward. Yet the more Michael examined the hidden office, the more impossible details he found. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. The following morning, he arrived before sunrise. The warehouse was silent except for the distant cry of seagulls outside. For a few moments, he stood alone inside the hidden office, looking at the rows of filing cabinets Samuel Harper had protected. Somewhere inside these records was the truth Frank hinted at. Somewhere inside was the reason his uncle spent decades guarding a forgotten building everyone else ignored. By mid-morning, Lisa arrived carrying several folders from the county archives. Daniel followed shortly afterward. The hidden office had become their unofficial headquarters. Coffee cups occupied one desk, maps covered another. Piles of notes grew larger each day. Nobody seemed interested in leaving until the mystery was solved. They began reviewing ownership records again. This time, Lisa focused on stock certificates, while Michael examined property transfers. Several hours passed with little progress. Then Lisa suddenly looked up. "Michael." Her tone immediately caught everyone's attention. She held up a certificate. "Look at this." Michael crossed the room. The document appeared ordinary at first. Harbor Transit Stock Certificate, Employee Ownership Allocation. Yet one detail stood out immediately. The certificate had never been canceled. Lisa handed over 3 more. Same result. Then 10 more. Then 20. Every single certificate remained active according to the paperwork. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Lisa hesitated. Potentially a lot. She explained that if Harbor Transit truly dissolved through bankruptcy, ownership interests should have been legally terminated. Yet hundreds of certificates appeared untouched, still valid, still recorded, still existing on paper. Silence settled over the room. Michael slowly looked around at the boxes surrounding them. There weren't dozens of certificates. There were thousands. Then another discovery deepened the mystery. While reviewing Samuel Harper's personal correspondence, Michael found a series of letters exchanged between company attorneys and financial auditors. Most were technical, boring, routine. Then he reached one dated only 3 months before the reported bankruptcy. The contents immediately made him sit up straighter. Harbor Transit remains financially stable. Michael reread the sentence twice, then 3 times. The letter wasn't speculative. It was an official financial assessment. More letters followed. Strong cash reserves, positive revenue projections, expansion opportunities. Nothing resembled a failing company. Nothing suggested bankruptcy. You need to see this, he called. Soon everyone crowded around the desk. Lisa reviewed the documents carefully. The deeper she read, the more concerned she appeared. These reports make no sense. Why? Daniel asked. Lisa tapped the paperwork. Because a company in this condition doesn't collapse overnight. Michael felt a chill run through him. Frank's comment suddenly seemed much less outrageous. If Harbor Transit wasn't failing financially, then what actually happened? The answer began emerging later that afternoon. Inside a locked filing cabinet near Samuel Harper's desk, Michael discovered a folder labeled Reorganization Proposals. At first, the contents appeared routine. Meetings, negotiations, investment discussions. Then one name appeared repeatedly. Atlantic Holdings Group. Nobody recognized it, yet the company surfaced again and again throughout the documents. Acquisition offers, ownership transfers, asset reviews. Every major decision seemed connected to Atlantic Holdings. Lisa immediately began researching. 2 hours later, she returned from the library archive, carrying photocopies. I found them. Michael looked up. Who? Atlantic Holdings. She dropped the papers onto the desk. The company existed only briefly before disappearing. Yet during that short period, it acquired significant portions of Harbor Transit's assets, warehouses, dock facilities, shipping contracts, valuable properties. Then Atlantic Holdings itself vanished a few years later. The pattern felt suspicious, almost designed to hide ownership trails. Daniel leaned back in his chair. So Harbor Transit disappears. He pointed toward the papers. Then its assets move somewhere else. Michael nodded slowly. And somehow nobody notices. The room grew quiet, because for the first time, a possible explanation emerged. Maybe Harbor Transit didn't fail. Maybe it was dismantled, piece by piece, asset by asset. Ownership transferred through complicated legal structures until nobody could follow the trail anymore. Then Michael discovered something extraordinary. Hidden inside one of Howard's notebooks was a hand-drawn diagram connecting dozens of companies and property transfers. The work clearly represented years of research, names connected through arrows, mergers, sales, ownership changes. Near the center of the page, Howard had written a single sentence in red ink. Follow the docks. Everything leads back to the docks. Curious. Michael pulled several property records from nearby files, then another, then another. His pulse began accelerating. Several waterfront properties originally owned by Harbor Transit still existed. More importantly, they had become extremely valuable. Luxury developments, commercial facilities, marina projects. The combined value reached into the tens of millions of dollars. Nobody spoke for several moments. The implications were staggering. Then Lisa quietly calculated something on her laptop. When she looked up, her expression had changed. "Michael." "What?" "If these stock certificates are legitimate," she paused, "and if ownership was never legally extinguished." Daniel immediately understood. The shareholders still own part of those assets. Silence filled the hidden office. Even the distant sounds of the harbor seemed to disappear. Michael stared at the rows of certificates stacked inside filing boxes. Dock workers, office clerks, supervisors, families, people who spent decades believing everything had been lost. Suddenly, the title of the story changed. These weren't just old documents. They weren't just historical records. They represented ownership. Real ownership. Ownership potentially worth millions. Then, as if the room wasn't already carrying enough tension, Michael noticed one final object hidden inside Samuel Harper's desk, a sealed envelope, thick, unopened. Across the front, written in Samuel's handwriting, were 6 words that instantly accelerated his heartbeat. "If Harbor Transit is declared bankrupt." Michael stared at the envelope, because deep down, he already knew what it meant. Samuel Harper had anticipated what was coming, and somewhere inside that envelope was probably the reason an entire company disappeared while its assets quietly survived. For several long moments, nobody touched the envelope. It sat in the center of Samuel Harper's desk like a message from another era. Outside, late afternoon sunlight streamed through the warehouse windows, casting long shadows across the hidden office. Michael stared at the handwritten words. "If Harbor Transit is declared bankrupt." The phrase alone felt like a warning. Not if Harbor Transit fails, not if Harbor Transit closes. If Harbor Transit is declared bankrupt. The wording suggested intent, deliberate action, almost as if Samuel expected something to happen to the company rather than believing it would happen naturally. Finally, Michael broke the seal. The paper inside crackled softly as he unfolded it. Daniel pulled his chair closer. Lisa stopped sorting documents entirely. Even Frank, who had been quietly reviewing old photographs, turned toward the desk. Michael began reading. "If you are opening this letter, then the company has either been taken from its owners or the truth has been buried." Silence settled over the room immediately. The opening sentence alone felt explosive. Michael continued. Samuel explained that Harbor Transit remained financially healthy during its final years. Revenue was strong. Expansion plans were underway. Employee ownership had reached its highest level. Yet according to the letter, a group of outside investors had begun acquiring influence through complex legal agreements and debt instruments most workers never understood. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the letter. Atlantic Holdings, North Shore Investments, Maritime Equity Partners, companies that seemed unrelated on the surface. Samuel claimed they were connected and working toward a single goal: control. The deeper Michael read, the darker the story became. Samuel described board meetings where pressure increased month after month. Proposals appeared that would shift ownership. Certain executives suddenly changed positions. Financial narratives no longer matched internal reports. Then came the sentence that made everyone in the room stop breathing. The bankruptcy was planned long before it was announced. Michael lowered the letter slightly. Nobody spoke. Daniel simply stared at the desk. Lisa looked genuinely stunned. Frank slowly removed his glasses. Samuel continued describing how valuable assets were quietly transferred before the public collapse. Properties, contracts, equipment, entire subsidiaries. By the time Harbor Transit officially entered bankruptcy proceedings, much of its value had already been moved elsewhere. Yet the most shocking revelation came several pages later. Samuel included copies of ownership schedules proving that thousands of employee shares were never legally extinguished. Those certificates still represented legitimate interests in surviving assets. Michael immediately thought about the boxes surrounding them, the forgotten certificates stacked inside filing cabinets, the paperwork everyone assumed was worthless. Suddenly they looked very different. Not souvenirs, not historical artifacts. Ownership records. Real ownership records. Then Frank quietly spoke. My father owned shares. Everyone looked at him. The old dock workers stared toward the warehouse floor below. A lot of workers did. His voice softened. People thought they lost everything. Nobody knew what to say. For decades, families believed their investments disappeared during the collapse. Entire generations accepted the official story. Yet according to Samuel's records, the story was incomplete, maybe even false. As evening approached, they continued reviewing the letter and supporting documents. Then Lisa discovered something extraordinary hidden inside the envelope. A master ownership ledger. Unlike the other records, this one tracked every shareholder, every transfer, every surviving interest. Hundreds of names filled its pages. Workers, managers, clerks, investors. Some owned tiny fractions. Others owned larger portions. Together, they represented a significant share of Harbor Transit's surviving assets. Michael ran his fingers across one page. Many names were followed by handwritten updates. Deceased, retired, relocated. Samuel had continued tracking people long after the company's collapse, as if he never stopped preparing for the possibility that someone would eventually find the records. Then Michael noticed another section near the back. The names there seemed different. Larger ownership percentages. More influence. Several matched individuals connected to Atlantic Holdings. Beside many entries, Samuel had written notes. Hidden transfer. Undisclosed interest. Conflict of interest. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that Samuel had spent years documenting how control of the company changed hands, not through open transactions, through a complicated network of hidden agreements. Around sunset, Daniel found another folder connected to the ownership ledger. Inside rested property evaluations conducted only months earlier. Michael nearly dropped the papers when he saw the numbers. Several waterfront properties originally linked to Harbor Transit had become extraordinarily valuable. Combined estimates exceeded tens of millions of dollars. The room fell silent again, not because of greed, because of scale. The forgotten certificates in the hidden office weren't connected to a few $1,000s. They were connected to assets that had quietly appreciated for 40 years. Assets families never knew they still had claims to. Then Lisa pointed toward a notation near the bottom of one report. Michael. He looked closer. The note referenced an ongoing legal trust, one still active today. The trust apparently controlled several former Harbor Transit assets. More importantly, it relied on ownership records nobody believed still existed. Nobody spoke. The implications were enormous. If the documents in the hidden office were authentic, they could completely reshape the legal history of Harbor Transit. Michael slowly leaned back in his chair. For weeks, he thought he was investigating an abandoned warehouse. Then he thought he was uncovering a forgotten company history. Now he realized something much bigger. The hidden office wasn't preserving the past. It was preserving evidence. Evidence that could affect living people, families, property ownership, millions of dollars in assets. As darkness settled outside, Michael carefully returned Samuel's letter to its folder. That's when he noticed a final handwritten note tucked beneath the last page. Unlike everything else, it wasn't formal, it wasn't legal. It was personal, addressed to whoever eventually found the archive. Michael read the sentence quietly. The documents matter, but the people matter more. He stared at the words for several seconds, then looked around the room. Samuel Harper hadn't hidden the records to create a fortune for someone. He hid them because he believed the truth belonged to the families who lost everything. And somewhere among the thousands of names filling those ledgers, Michael realized, were people who still had no idea their lives were about to change. The following week became one of the strangest periods of Michael Turner's life. Every morning, he unlocked Warehouse 14, expecting to find another piece of Harbor Transit's forgotten history. Every evening, he left carrying more questions than answers. The hidden office had transformed from a mystery into something far more complicated. It was now a potential legal archive connected to real people, real assets, and real families. Yet before anyone could make public claims, they needed proof, not theories, not suspicions. Proof. Lisa spent most of her days comparing shareholder records with public archives. Daniel helped organize property documents. Frank reached out to several retired dock workers who still remembered Harbor Transit. Slowly, names from the ledgers began turning into real people, real stories. One afternoon, Frank brought an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis to the warehouse. She moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but her memory remained remarkably sharp. When Michael showed her one of the ownership ledgers, she immediately recognized a name. "That's my father." Everyone looked up. Margaret pointed toward an entry showing ownership certificates issued in 1978. Her father had worked as a shipping supervisor for nearly 20 years. According to family history, he lost everything when Harbor Transit collapsed. She still remembered the day he came home carrying a box of personal belongings from the docks. "He never talked about it afterward," she said quietly. "He believed the company was gone." Michael showed her copies of the certificates linked to her father's name. Tears immediately appeared in her eyes, not because of potential money, because for the first time in decades, she was looking at evidence that her father hadn't imagined everything. His ownership had been real. His investment had been real. His loss had been real. After she left, the atmosphere inside the hidden office changed. The records no longer felt historical. They felt personal. Every name represented a family. Every certificate represented trust. Every missing record represented a story someone never fully understood. That realization stayed with Michael throughout the week. Then another breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. While reviewing old property filings, Lisa discovered something hidden inside county records. Several Harbor Transit assets had never actually disappeared. They had been transferred into a trust. The trust still existed. More importantly, it still held ownership interests in multiple waterfront properties. Michael stared at the documents. "You're sure?" Lisa nodded. "Absolutely." She pointed toward several filings. "The trust never closed." Daniel leaned forward. "How much are we talking about?" Lisa hesitated, then slid a property valuation report across the desk. The numbers immediately silenced the room. Several former industrial parcels had become prime waterfront developments over the last 4 decades. Restaurants, office complexes, marina facilities, commercial leases, combined values reached far beyond what any of them expected. Michael slowly sat back in his chair. The title of Samuel Harper's letter suddenly made more sense than ever. The documents weren't merely worth millions, they were connected to millions. Yet what mattered most wasn't the value itself. It was ownership. Who actually owned those assets? The answer appeared increasingly tied to the forgotten shareholder records hidden inside Warehouse 14. Later that afternoon, Michael found another box near the rear of the office. Unlike most containers, it carried no label. Inside rested dozens of cassette tapes, audio recordings, each carefully numbered. Daniel looked surprised. "Please tell me we can play these." By evening, they found an old tape player buried inside a storage cabinet. The machine barely functioned, but after several attempts, a voice finally emerged through the speakers. The room immediately fell silent. Samuel Harper, the founder himself. The recording appeared to be a private journal, not formal meetings, not corporate reports. Personal reflections. His voice sounded calm, but tired. Throughout the recordings, Samuel described ongoing legal disputes, boardroom conflicts, and growing concerns about ownership transfers. Then one particular tape changed everything. On it, Samuel discussed a meeting held only weeks before Harbor Transit officially declared bankruptcy. According to his account, several executives approved transactions transferring valuable assets away from employee ownership structures. Samuel openly opposed the decision. His frustration was obvious even decades later. Then came the sentence that made everyone stop listening and stare at one another. "If these transfers stand, thousands of shareholders will never know what was taken from them." Silence filled the room. Even the tape player seemed louder afterward. Samuel wasn't speculating. He was documenting, recording, preserving testimony. The tapes transformed suspicions into something much stronger: evidence. As darkness settled outside the warehouse windows, Michael continued listening. Tape after tape revealed the same pattern: missing records, hidden ownership changes, asset transfers disguised through complicated legal structures. Samuel had been documenting everything, preparing for the possibility that official records would not survive. Then, near the end of one recording, his voice softened. "If someone is listening to this years from now, the warehouse still exists." Michael looked toward the hidden office surrounding them. Samuel continued, "If the warehouse survives, the truth survives." Nobody spoke. The sentence hung in the air long after the tape stopped. For decades, people assumed Harbor Transit disappeared. Yet Samuel had anticipated that possibility. He built a hidden archive, preserved documents, recorded testimony, protected evidence. And somehow, through Uncle Howard, the warehouse endured. Then, as they prepared to leave for the night, Lisa opened one final folder recovered from the unmarked box. Inside was a list titled "Original Shareholders' Final Contact Records." Hundreds of names filled the pages: addresses, family information, ownership percentages. Samuel's final attempt to keep track of the people connected to Harbor Transit. Michael slowly turned the pages. Many names were familiar now, others weren't. But one realization became impossible to ignore. The mystery was no longer about discovering what happened. They were already uncovering that truth. The real challenge was what came next. Because somewhere out there were families who still believed everything had been lost. Families who had no idea a forgotten warehouse, an old founder's archive, and a stack of hidden documents were about to bring their history back into the light. The weeks that followed felt less like an investigation and more like the slow awakening of a forgotten community. Every day brought another name from Samuel Harper's records, another family, another story. Michael spent countless hours inside the hidden office, making phone calls, sending letters, and meeting people who had once been connected to Harbor Transit. Most arrived with skepticism. Some arrived with hope. Nearly all left with emotions they didn't expect. One afternoon, a retired mechanic named Robert Jenkins walked into the warehouse carrying a weathered cardboard box. He placed it carefully on Samuel Harper's old desk and opened the lid. Inside were photographs, employee badges, and a faded stock certificate his father received in 1977. Robert had kept it for decades because his father refused to throw it away. "He always said it meant something," Robert told Michael. "Nobody believed him." Michael compared the certificate to the ownership ledger. The serial numbers matched perfectly. Robert's father still appeared in the records. The silence that followed seemed to affect everyone in the room. For the first time, Robert wasn't looking at an old piece of paper. He was looking at proof that his father's memory had been right all along. Similar moments began happening almost daily. A former shipping clerk discovered her mother's ownership records. A retired dock supervisor located shares belonging to his grandfather. Families who thought their connection to Harbor Transit ended 40 years earlier suddenly found themselves part of a story that was still unfolding. Yet while Michael focused on the people, Lisa focused on the documents. Her research continued uncovering connections between the old ownership records and the surviving trust that controlled former Harbor Transit assets. Every new discovery strengthened the same conclusion. The ownership trail had never truly disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath decades of legal complexity. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything. Late one evening, Lisa rushed into the hidden office carrying a thick folder of newly obtained records. Her expression alone told Michael something important had happened. "I found the transfer agreement," she said. Everyone stopped what they were doing. "What transfer agreement?" Daniel asked. Lisa spread several documents across the desk. "The one Samuel was trying to stop." Michael immediately moved closer. The paperwork detailed a complicated series of transactions completed only weeks before Harbor Transit declared bankruptcy. At first glance, the language seemed impossibly technical. But one detail stood out. Several key asset transfers required shareholder approval that appeared questionable. Lisa pointed toward a highlighted section. "Look at the signatures." Michael studied the page, then frowned. Several signatures looked nearly identical. Too identical. Daniel noticed it too. Those were copied. Lisa nodded. "That's what I think." Silence settled over the room. If true, the implications were enormous. Samuel Harper hadn't merely opposed a business decision. He may have been trying to stop an unlawful transfer of assets. The next several days became a race to verify the evidence. Lisa contacted legal historians. Daniel tracked down old corporate records. Frank spoke with retired employees who remembered the final years of Harbor Transit. Piece by piece, The picture became clearer. The bankruptcy had not occurred the way people believed. Certain transactions remained deeply questionable. Ownership records were incomplete. Critical documents disappeared. Yet somehow, Samuel's hidden archive preserved enough evidence to reconstruct much of the truth. Then one rainy afternoon, Michael discovered another surprise hidden among Samuel's files. A stack of unopened letters addressed to former shareholders. Hundreds of them, each prepared but never mailed. Curious, he opened one. The letter explained concerns about ownership transfers and urged shareholders to demand transparency. Another carried similar warnings. Then another. Samuel had apparently tried to alert people. The effort never succeeded. Nobody knew whether the letters were intercepted, abandoned, or simply never sent. Yet their existence revealed something important. Samuel hadn't accepted what was happening. He fought it, every way he knew how. That evening, Michael sat alone in the hidden office after everyone else had gone home. Rain tapped softly against the warehouse windows. The old desk lamp illuminated Samuel Harper's records. Nearby sat boxes of shareholder certificates, family photographs, audio recordings, evidence collected over decades. Michael found himself staring at the founder's photograph hanging above the desk. For weeks, he had viewed Samuel as a mystery, a businessman erased from history. Now he saw something else. A man who spent years trying to protect people who trusted him. A man who knew he might lose, yet preserved the truth anyway. His thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. The number belonged to a legal researcher Lisa had contacted earlier that week. Michael listened quietly as the man explained his findings. By the time the conversation ended, Michael's pulse had accelerated. He immediately called Lisa, then Daniel, then Frank. Less than an hour later, all four stood inside the hidden office once again. "Tell us," Daniel said. Michael looked around the room, then toward the stacks of ownership records surrounding them. Finally, he spoke. "The trust still recognizes the original shareholder structure." Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Michael continued. "Legally, those ownership interests may still matter." Frank slowly lowered himself into a chair. Lisa covered her mouth. Daniel stared at the documents, because suddenly the story had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer just history, no longer just evidence, no longer just a forgotten mystery hidden inside an abandoned warehouse. The records Samuel Harper protected might actually have the power to restore something that families lost decades ago. As the rain continued falling outside, Michael looked around the hidden office one more time. The warehouse worth $4,500 had already changed his life. But for the first time, he realized it might be about to change hundreds of others as well. And somewhere among the remaining documents, he suspected, waited the final piece of evidence Samuel Harper had spent 40 years hoping someone would eventually find. The final chapter of the mystery unfolded more quietly than Michael ever expected. There were no dramatic courtroom confrontations, no television crews parked outside Warehouse 14, no sudden fortunes appearing overnight. Instead, the truth emerged the same way Samuel Harper had preserved it, one document at a time. Over the following months, legal experts, historians, and financial analysts reviewed the archive hidden inside the warehouse. Every ownership ledger was examined. Every stock certificate was verified. Every transfer agreement was traced. The process moved slowly, but the conclusions remained remarkably consistent. Harbor Transit's story had never been fully told. Important records had survived. Important ownership interests had survived. And most importantly, the people connected to those records had survived. Michael often found himself standing quietly inside the hidden office, watching the process unfold. The room that once sat forgotten behind a sealed wall was now filled with activity. Researchers sorted files, volunteers scanned documents, former employees visited to share memories. What had once been a hidden archive slowly became a living piece of community history. One afternoon, Margaret Ellis returned to the warehouse. This time she wasn't alone. Her daughter and grandson accompanied her. Michael watched as 3 generations stood together studying the shareholder records connected to Margaret's father. The elderly woman smiled through tears. He always believed somebody would eventually understand what happened. Moments like that became increasingly common. Families arrived carrying photographs, old employee badges, letters, stories passed down for decades. Many discovered that their parents or grandparents still appeared in Samuel Harper's records. Some learned that forgotten ownership interests still held value. Others simply gained something equally important: answers. The more Michael witnessed these reunions with history, the less he thought about money. The real reward wasn't financial, it was personal. Then came the day the town held its first public exhibition inside Warehouse 14. The event exceeded every expectation. Hundreds of residents attended. Retired dock workers reunited with former co-workers. Families explored displays documenting harbor transit's rise and fall. Local students interviewed elderly visitors about life along the waterfront. For the first time in decades, the warehouse felt alive again. Near the center of the exhibition stood a glass display containing Samuel Harper's letter. Several original stock certificates and photographs recovered from the hidden office. One image drew particular attention: the company photograph that had once been altered, the version where Samuel Harper had been cut away. Beside it hung the complete version Michael discovered inside the hidden office. Visitors stopped constantly to compare them, to see how someone had literally removed the founder from the story. Yet now Samuel stood exactly where he belonged, in the center. Later that afternoon, the mayor addressed the crowd. During her remarks, she announced that Warehouse 14 would be preserved as a historical archive and community heritage center. Applause filled the building. Michael glanced toward Frank, Lisa, and Daniel. None of them seemed surprised. The warehouse had become more than an old building. It had become proof that history mattered. As months passed, additional legal reviews confirmed what Samuel Harper suspected decades earlier. Many ownership interests had never been properly resolved. Several families received settlements connected to surviving assets. Others recovered rights they never knew existed. Not every outcome involved large sums of money. Some involved modest payments. Others involved recognition. Yet nearly every family expressed the same sentiment. They were grateful to finally know the truth. One cold autumn evening, nearly a year after inheriting the warehouse, Michael remained alone inside the hidden office. Most of the restoration work was complete. The shelves had been preserved, the desk restored, the records organized. Sunlight faded beyond the harbor as he sat where Samuel Harper once sat. For a long time, he simply looked around the room. When he first arrived, he was a man with less than $5,000 in savings and no clear direction. He believed he had inherited a worthless warehouse. Now he understood that Howard Turner had left him something far more valuable: a purpose, a mystery worth solving, a chance to help people. His attention drifted toward a framed photograph recently placed above the desk. It showed Samuel Harper standing outside Harbor Transit, surrounded by employees. Not executives, not investors. workers, the people who built the company. Michael smiled. The image seemed to capture everything Samuel cared about. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see a young boy standing in the doorway with his grandfather. The pair had visited several times during the restoration project. The boy pointed toward Samuel's photograph. "Is that him?" Michael nodded. "That's Samuel Harper." The child studied the image carefully. "The man who hid all the documents." Michael smiled. "That's right." The boy thought about that for a moment, then asked the kind of simple question children often ask. "Was he rich?" Michael looked toward the photograph, then toward the shelves of records surrounding them. Finally, he glanced through the warehouse windows toward the harbor beyond. "Maybe," he said, "but that's not why people remember him." The boy looked curious. "Then why?" Michael smiled softly. "Because he protected the truth when it would have been easier not to." The child nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. A moment later, he followed his grandfather back toward the exhibition hall. Michael remained seated for a few seconds longer. Outside, harbor lights reflected across the water. Inside, Warehouse 14 stood warm and alive once again. The building worth $4,500 had contained documents worth millions. But in the end, that wasn't the real treasure hidden behind the sealed wall. The real treasure was the truth Samuel Harper refused to let disappear. A truth that restored forgotten histories, reunited families with their past, and reminded an entire town that some stories are worth protecting, no matter how many years it takes for them to be found.